Let's get straight to the point. Atlantis is real history, but most people don't know it. So here's a short video on the history of Atlantis. It's based on archaeology that anybody can check, and well-known ancient Greek texts that anybody can read. Now this is just the quick version. For details, references and image credits, visit answers.com/Atlantis. Now our history begins about 20,000 BC when the people of Atlantis arrive. Herodotus said that Atlantis was the name of the mountains of Atlas, and of the people who lived there. Archaeologists now call them Ibero-Mauritanians. Pliny said that Atlantia was the old name for all of Africa south of Libya and Egypt. Now in 20,000 BC, when our history begins, the Sahara was even drier than it is today, but the mountains of Atlas were wetter. They were more fertile, so the people of Atlantis flourished. But in 8700 BC, the Younger Dryas event finally hit the Atlas Mountains. This was 1,000 years of drought. And suddenly all the Ibero-Mauritanian sites disappeared. But where did they go? Hundreds of years later, we see them again, or some very similar people, further towards Egypt. But what happened in between? Back in those days, 9000 BC, most people were nomads. They spent their time on the move. So when there's a drought, you just keep moving. And if you come from mountains, or you love mountains, and you're experts at mountain living, so you look for more mountains. But mountains without a drought, obviously. So, like the mountains at the top of this map. Now, we can't prove that the Ibero-Mauritanians reached Greece, but nomads can move a heck of a long way in 1,000 years. So it would be very surprising if they didn't. Or some of them. Now, the Ibero-Mauritanians didn't like crossing the sea, so they'd follow the coast. At first it's just desert with the same kind of drought that they're running away from, so they'll keep going. And the first people they're going to meet are the people of the Nile. Around 9000 BC, that's the Natufians, the Sibylians and the Quadens. Archaeology shows that when the Ibero-Mauritanians moved east, the Sibyllian culture and Quadan cultures both were wiped out. They ceased to be. They are dead, they are gone. This is not a good sign. And the Natufians, actually is a local group of Natufians called the Harifians, they had to flee. Now you have to understand that the Ibero-Mauritanians were not like local people. They had a different DNA, they were barely related at all, even their skulls looked different, and they were expert hunters, whereas the local Natufians hardly ever used bows and arrows. So the Ibero-Mauritanians were very, very scary. They appear one day, they want your land, they can kill you. They are the stuff that legends are made of. So this battle for land over the Younger Dryas, which by the way was the world's first ever war, is something that was never going to be forgotten. Now the Ibero-Mauritanians liked high ground, like mountains, like I said. So the Harifians, that is the local Natufians, stayed in the low ground. They stayed in the oak forests. And the houses were half buried, so they were very easy to disguise with branches. And for the first time they weaponed up. They started using lots of arrows. This war between Atlantis and the Nile peoples would have been recorded, of course, because this is the era about 9000 BC when people started building monuments. We can see these monuments at Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, Tel Caramel and elsewhere. These monuments were covered in images, records of what the tribe did not want to forget. And smaller portable stones had writing, not with alphabets like we have today, but symbols and pictures, mnemonics to jog the memory. Now with the Proto-Egyptian tribes out of the way, only the Aegean tribes stood between the Ibero-Mauritanians and their dream mountains. But unlike the Harifian Natufians, the Aegeans were already experts with the bow and arrow. Now maybe no Ibero-Mauritanian ever travelled north, but the Aegeans had boats and were not afraid to use them. And the Aegeans, working on islands, had much more experience with different tribes and defending limited territories. And the Aegeans had links with the Anatolians, so were technologically 1,000 years ahead of the Ibero-Mauritanians. So there's a very high chance that at some time in the 1,000-year Dryas period, at least one Aegean would travel south, come into contact with an Ibero-Mauritanian, and the Ibero-Mauritanian would lose. All archaeology can tell us is that the Ibero-Mauritanians left, they nearly all died, and hundreds of years later they rebuilt their civilization on the eastern edge of their drought-stricken lands. So basically Plato was right, they killed the Egyptians, but the ancestors of the Athenians beat them. Now I mentioned how when the Egyptian Natufians fled, they started using arrows for the first time. But that's not all. The Natufians also built a great big wall, gigantic thing like 12 foot, 18 foot high, 6 foot wide, and a defensive tower, I think it was 28 foot high, at their main watering hole. This was the world's first ever city. This is when humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and became city people. And for 5,000 years, this great wall and defensive tower were the tallest buildings in the world. 5,000 years. Now, the people who stayed at Jericho, of course, couldn't be nomads anymore, as I said, so they had to rely on farming, and they got better and better at it. So by 6000 BC, they were so good at farming that a load of farmers decided to move back to Egypt, because before that, Egypt was not a very good place to live due to the annual flooding of the Nile. But by 6000, it was very profitable to farm. So it was very well worth creating canals, digging dams, planting fields, and basically turning the Nile into one gigantic big farm, and it became the breadbasket of the world. These fields made so much surplus that the local chiefs grew richer and richer. They basically became kings and enslaved everybody else. By 3100 BC, one of them gained control of the whole Nile. His name was Menes, the first pharaoh. Of course, the pharaohs want people to think that they created the Egyptian Empire in 3100 BC, but it was the exact same Natufian lands it always had been. The power simply had moved to where the farm was. It had moved from Jericho to Egypt. 3100 BC was just a new boss, same as the old boss. The real beginning, remember, the real origin of Egyptian civilization is back when they stopped being hunter-gatherers and became farmers and city builders for the first time back in 8000 BC. This is important because Plato's History of Atlantis says the Atlanteans moved east in 9000 BC, that they defeated the ancestors of the Egyptians, that the Egyptian constitution was founded 8000 BC. And modern scholars say 8000 BC is crazy, everybody knows it's 3100 BC, it's impossible, far too early, ridiculous. And yet archaeology shows us that is exactly what happened. Plato was right, we should have listened to the history. Okay, fast forward to 605 BC, disaster. The Egyptian Empire falls apart, the Babylonians capture most of it apart from Egypt itself. The pharaoh at the time, Necho II, had to get his empire back somehow, but he couldn't go east anymore, Babylon was just too powerful. Somebody suggested that he could look west instead. They could conquer Libya, what we call Africa, or trade with them, and any other nations in that direction. But first they had to know what was out there. They were pretty sure that Libya and below it Atlantia were small enough to sail around, and if Atlantia was bigger than they thought, they were pretty sure that the rivers would join up in the middle perhaps. That is, from both east coast and west coast, the rivers would originate at the same inland lakes, so you could sail from one side to the other, cutting Africa in half. That was a common belief right up to almost modern times, that Africa was cut in half by rivers. Like in 500 BC, the great explorer Euthymenes discovered the mouth of the river Senegal, and he was convinced that he had found the other end of the Nile. So Necho was going to have a look. He hired some Phoenician sailors to sail around Atlantia and Libya and see what was there. When they found a really good place to explore, they'd stop, plant seeds, and while the seeds grew, they'd spend a few months exploring inland. Now, the last major stop on the tour around Africa would probably have been the Bay of Arguin in Mauritania. Because it's so fertile, there were so many rivers, it's just a really interesting place to stop. And soon after it, many other explorers like Hanno came to the same place. So even if the Pharaoh's people didn't see what I'm going to describe, Hanno's people would have done. He had thousands of people, they settled, they were exploring, they were discovering some amazing stuff. Before we see what they found, we've got to understand the state of world mapping in 600 BC. This is crucial to understanding why Atlantis was an island and why they thought it sank into the sea. Now, since time began, the world was thought of as one landmass, just wherever you lived, that was the world. But as people explored, they started to discover other lands. The Greeks began to think there's really kind of two land masses, two continents, Europe, which is cold and green, and Asia, which is like big and hot. Now, Libya was just thought of as one corner of Asia. And as more people explored Libya, though, they thought this is very different from Europe and different from Asia. So we should be thinking of three continents, not two. Europe, Asia, and Libya. And what else is there? Maybe there's a fourth continent somewhere. Now, remember how I said that they thought Libya and Atlantia were cut in half by a river? Now, the known continents were all separated by rivers. A lot of people said this meant the continents were pretty much like islands. Okay, they're connected some tiny bit, but they're basically islands. Hence, the ancient historian Strabo recorded, there has been much deliberation about the continents, and that some divide them by the rivers the Nile and the Tanais, describing them as islands. The continents were described as being islands. If it's separated by a river, you can only get to it by crossing the water, it's an island. So, when Nico's Phoenician explorers encircled Atlantia and Libya, they found that while Libya was a desert, Atlantia had mighty rivers with enormous wide river mouths. Atlantia was gigantic, bigger than Libya and Asia combined. Asia as they knew it then. And it was just completely different from the other continents. They discovered a new fourth continent, separated by rivers just like the rest of them. So they now had Asia, they had Europe, they had Libya, and they had this new continent that had Atlantia on it, but they couldn't call it Atlantia because that was a male name. Continents always have female names. Now both Atlantis and Atlantia are named after the Titan Atlas, and Atlas was known for his many daughters. So the daughter of Atlas would be a kind of obvious name for the Atlantia continent. Daughter of Atlas, which of course in Greek is Atlantis. It's possible that this site was already called Atlantis before the Phoenicians arrived, because between about 7,500 BC and 3000 BC the Sahara was much wetter. There was a great big river, the Tamanrasset, which joined the Atlas Mountains to Atlantia. So you could go from Atlas Mountains all the way down to Atlantia, and the first thing you find there is another little set of Atlas Mountains, just much smaller. So it's entirely possible that people had always known this entrance to Atlantia as being a little daughter of the Atlas Mountains, or a little Atlantis. Now let's look at what the Phoenicians would have found when they explored inland from the Bay of Arguin. The first thing they're going to do is follow the dried up riverbed, except they don't know it's a dried up riverbed. All they see is somewhere that obviously a lot of water has flowed in the past. They keep walking up it, trying to find some mountains they can climb so they can see what's there. What they're going to find after about 3 or 4 days travel is Ben Emira. This is Africa's largest monolith. Spectacular, gigantic mountain, very easy to climb though, and from its top you can see all the surrounding lands for miles and miles and miles, including some distant mountains, the ones I was talking about, the ones that might have been called the Daughters of Atlas. And from that ridge you can see the greatest wonder of Atlantia, the Richat structure, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now on the way to the Richat structure, while they're crossing the Tamanrasset, dried up river and so on, they'll be seeing a lot of ancient rock art, showing not just the usual things, animals and people, but also weapons, shields, boats in what was then supposed to be a desert, and chariots. Lots of chariots. In fact, there's over 1,200 sites across the Sahara that show chariots. They liked their chariots for some reason. Now with that in mind, imagine yourself as the Phoenicians, you're thinking about all this mud, this dried up riverbed, all these chariots, you climb the mountain, you see this amazing Richat structure. It's like nothing that's ever been seen in nature. It surely has to be man-made. How do you explain it? It's 25 miles across, it's got multiple huge walls, massive defensive moats. What were the people like who built this thing? This gigantic fortress, which somehow was destroyed and for some reason nobody ever rebuilt it, as if the people didn't have enough time to get away and nobody survived. So as they looked at this ancient fortress covered in mud and sand, they're going to remember the other mud and sand they've seen on the way there. The whole place is just covered in mud and sand. Right at the bay when they first arrived, there's just huge sandbars. There's gigantic piles of seashells. This, by the way, is now part of a national park, because the mud banks attract so many wild birds from all across Africa. They'd remember that path they took along the dried up riverbed, which of course they wouldn't know was a river because the actual river part of it was very small. Sometime in the past, huge quantities of mud and water have rushed down here and they don't anymore. What is the obvious logical conclusion from this evidence? There must have been a gigantic cataclysmic ancient flood. Completely destroyed everything in a day or so there was no time to escape, which is exactly the kind of thing that had happened multiple times on the coasts of Greece. It's not an unusual idea, it's entirely logical based on the evidence. Now a fortress that size, that implies an enormous number of people to build it, and it implies a careful division of labour, and it implies quite a lot of stability. So the thinkers amongst them could immediately draw conclusions about the priests that must have been there, the artisans, the kings, the rulers. They can start to get an idea of the shape of the society that must have existed in order to build this structure. And the size of it, 25 miles across. Think of the farms that must have supplied such a building. Now clearly this structure must have been the capital of a huge empire. And all of this was logical, given the scale of the fortress, the size of its walls, the depth and width of its harbours, its great big circular road, and so on. So you can estimate the size of its navy, the scale of its technology, everything. Now, between the capital and the Bay of Arguin, there's a great big plain, measures about 330 miles by 250 miles, or 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, as Plato put it. And that had the signs of once being a very well-watered, fertile land, so it would have been full of people. Imagine talking about this on the way home when they finally get back. Imagine the excitement, telling the Phoenician cities news coming to Egypt. They found that Atlantia is actually a new continent separated by rivers. It was once a vast and advanced empire, but it was destroyed in a flood, probably in a single day. Now, we now know they were wrong about the structure being man-made. They were therefore wrong about all the other conclusions which followed from that, about the scale of the Atlantean Empire and the level of their technology. But their belief was logical, based on the evidence that they had. Now, in 600 BC, the same time that the Phoenicians were discovering Atlantis, Solon, the father of democracy, was writing the laws of Athens. And afterwards he visited Egypt. And he was just standing around telling somebody about the ancient history of Athens and how the oldest history he knows goes back to 1500 BC, when a local priest overheard him. This priest had heard about the size of Atlantia, and he remembered how the Atlantes had once defeated the Egyptians, and yet had in turn probably been defeated by the Athenians. And here was an Athenian telling him that 1500 BC was ancient history. Plato records what the priest says: "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Hellenes, you are never anything but children. There's not an old man among you." Solon in return asked him what he meant. "I mean to say," he replied, "that in mind you're all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why." So you see, the priest, he knew about the 1500 BC, the flood of Deucalion. Probably that was when the volcano on the island of Thera exploded. It sent a massive tsunami, destroyed the coasts of Greece, destroying all their cities, and of course destroying their ancient records. And so as far as they knew, their history pretty much began in 1500 BC, because everything before that had gone. But the priest knew better. The priest knew there were a lot more floods than Solon knew about. Like, for example, the flood about 1000 BC, where the civilization of Pavlopetri sank beneath the sea. Or back in 5600 BC, when a huge area of the Black Sea was flooded. We think the Straits of Bosphorus might have burst, allowing the Mediterranean Sea to flood in. Even today, our archaeologists are always finding new examples of sunken cities. And these examples are just in the regions around Athens. Now imagine how many more examples there are all over the world. So clearly, catastrophic sudden destruction from floods or earthquakes or whatever is more common than we think over a long period of time. Now, when studying history, we should always remember to see things as the people there saw them. For example, people often say, opposite the Pillars of Hercules, he must have been in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No, look at the map. Opposite the Pillars of Hercules simply meant straight ahead, which meant down the coast, not into the ocean, because practically all ocean travel was along the coasts in those days. Besides, on the subject of travelling down the coast, Plato said the remains of the flood became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. Now, for the mud to be an impassable barrier, it's got to imply that you're travelling along the coast. Otherwise, you just sail around it. Now, when studying history, we should also remember who is speaking and why. Now, when Plato describes Atlantis, he's remembering things that he heard at the age of 10 years old. That is in 417 BC, when it looked like Sparta was about to destroy Athens. Now, Critias was an old man. He was trying to give Plato hope, so he remembered this story, showing how times were just as bad. They thought they had no hope, but Athens won. Now, when studying history, we should also remember to carefully examine the sources and where they come from. For example, Plato talks about the Atlantis ships being triremes, that's large Greek galleons. But that's just because triremes are the only fighting boats that Plato would have known. But Plato said that the names of things in the story of Atlantis are translated from Egyptian. Now, Egyptian at the time only had a few words for boat. So Plato is just assuming that the boats are triremes. They were much more likely to be reed boats, or being 9000 BC, probably dugout canoes. So that's Plato's History of Atlantis. Now, Plato died in 347 BC. Then in 334, Alexander the Great conquered much of Asia. and for the first time Greeks had a very good idea of exactly how Europe joins to Asia, so the idea of continents as islands was very soon forgotten. Then around 330 BC, Pseudo-Skylax was published. This document was a guide to the world's coasts. Now, regarding West Africa, it soon became very clear that the mud banks around the Bay of Arguin were just a local feature, and so nobody thought of the whole of Atlantia being flooded after that. Now, just after that, about 325 BC, Herodotus published his great works on history and geography. Now, he knew nothing about the Younger Dryas or how the ancient Atlantis people moved east. So for the next 2,000 years, Atlantis seemed to be just this story that Plato came up with about some islands. Where? Then in 1816, a scholar called Jean-Baptiste Joseph Lombre made a minor error. He mistakenly linked two completely unrelated quotes, and he made it look like Aristotle did not believe in Atlantis. And ever since then, people have been saying that Aristotle thought Atlantis was fiction. For example, Wikipedia states that Aristotle believed that Plato, his teacher, had invented the island to teach philosophy. And Wikipedia, as a source, quotes galaxy science fiction. Apparently Aristotle did not read galaxy science fiction because he didn't know he was supposed to reject Atlantis, because all of Aristotle's actual published works indicates that he considered Atlantis to be historical. For a thorough investigation of all the evidence, I recommend Aristotle and Atlantis by Torvald Frank. Now that's about the end of this short history of Atlantis. To recap, about 9000 BC the Ibero-Maurusians moved east in search of pasture. The Natufians weaponed up and created the world's first city. This led to improvements in agriculture and turned the Nile into one big farm. But one day the Babylonians took most of the Natufian Egyptian lands. So the pharaoh looked west for new lands to conquer. He didn't find any, but he did find an amazing natural fortress. And in conclusion, the Atlantes defeated Egypt 9000 BC. They could not defeat Athens. Egypt's constitution dates to 8000 BC, as Plato said. Africa, as divided by the Tamanrasset or Senegal rivers, could be classed as two island continents as defined at the time. The gateway to Atlantia and associated mountains, plain, fauna, coastline, etc. are exactly as Plato described, and you can go and see them for yourself. Atlantis was the natural name for both the Adrar Plateau and Atlantia. And any errors are the result of Plato being logical with the best available information. The bottom line is that Plato was as reliable as any historian can be. Thanks for watching.